Just because it's adult fantasy doesn't mean that you need to swear, you need to use explicitly sexual language everywhere. Hello everyone, my name is Lisa and I'm the Viet vegan because I'm Vietnam vegan, and today is another book video day. I'm going to be recapping the books that I read in March and what I'm going to be reading next month. I started off January with like a bang. I read 12 books. It was awesome. And I was hoping to continue this momentum into February. But February, I just got like a lot more behind and a lot of stuff and a lot of like personal stuff happened. So as such, I am behind in my 2-book-a-week goal, which was kind of a bummer. But you know what? That's fine. I'm still like technically ahead of my reading goal so far. My goal is to hit 100 books by the end of the year. We'll see how it goes. There was like a couple points in September and October where I managed to read like 20 books in a month, or like 25 books in a month. And some of them were like long books, but seems I do not have that same momentum anymore. So let's talk about some of the books that I read in February. So the first book that I'm going to talk about was a book that I actually finished in January, but I hadn't finished it by the time my last video came out, so I didn't have a chance to talk about it. But the book is called Queenie by Candice Carty-Williams. I really struggled with this book. So I love books like this, where it's like a book about personal growth and a journey and all that kind of stuff, but I just found the character was so self-destructive and self-sabotaging that it was like really hard to read, because I see her in some people in my life and it was just really hard to see. I felt like a lot of the characters were very like caricaturized versions of people in real life. And like, I get that that's like what books tend to be a lot of the time, but one of the examples was Queenie's youngest cousin. I think she was like in high school or like early university, but she just like was a stereotype of like a Gen Zer. I just don't feel like it was a very good representation of like younger people. I did really like Queenie's overall growth in like the last 30% of the book, but the first 70% was like so difficult to get through because like everyone was just so cringe, toxic, like self-destructive. It was just really hard to read. It did cover a lot of things about like being Black and dealing with like the stereotypes and the hypersexualization of like certain aspects. I felt like it was important to read from that perspective. It was difficult. But what I really liked about this book were Queenie's grandparents. I just felt like they were so OG and so awesome and like so real. Like they felt like real people to me. Like they existed, and like the way they reacted, the personality traits, they were very vivid characters, and I think like they were the ones that I was most interested in this book. I rated it a 3-star. Oh, one of the things that I noticed in this book, this is something that I've noticed more recently in reading books now that I'm like actively anti-racist and like actively trying to read and notice these things, and this is something that my friend Laura mentioned and that like I've never stopped noticing ever since she pointed it out. But this book does that thing where it'll specify if a character is like a BIPOC character, but it won't specify when someone is white. So the default is white. I think it just matters to clarify, especially since in this book, microaggressions and like anti-racism were significant themes in the story. So I just felt like it was like a little odd that like the default character was white. Since it's been a while since I read it, I'm just like reading through my review. I wrote in my review that I really enjoyed Queenie's journey because it wasn't like she finds a man in the end and she's happy. It was like her discovery with like herself, her relationship with herself, and like her friends that she was mostly concerned about, which I appreciated and enjoyed. I really liked the patois that was like peppered throughout the book. I just thought it was really like charming and lovely, and it breathed a lot of life into the family and the characters. I rated it 3 stars. It was mostly character driven. I liked the overall growth, but it was like really hard to read because it was just like so self-sabotagey. I think overall it was a good book, but I just like had a really hard time being patient with Queenie as a character. The next book was technically the first book that I read in February, and like this book was so hard for me to read because the writing style was so cringe. I was baffled that Sarah J. Maas wrote like this. I watched Plant-Based Bride's review on this in her last wrap-up video. In that video, she describes the writing style of this so perfectly and so succinctly. I think it's supposed to be written as an adult fantasy fiction. Just because it's adult fantasy doesn't mean that you need to swear, you need to use explicitly sexual language everywhere. It was so excessively sexual for no reason. Every single new character that was described was like how attractive they were or how much someone wanted to bang that character, and it was just like so distracting. And it's like, okay, I get it, everybody is hot, everybody wants to bang each other, like cool. Can we move on with the story, please? And I just felt like it was so unnecessary and so distracting because I feel like there was more to this book and this character than just whether or not people were attractive. And I get that this is something that happens a lot in like romantic fantasy fiction, especially from Sarah J Maas, because all of her other series have been written in that way where like everyone is beautiful and, you know, eventually there's sexual stuff that happens. And like, I understand the point of sexual tension. It had a very similar romance trope to it. In a lot of romance books, there's like that trope where like there's these two characters that hate each other, but eventually they just like can't resist. They're opposites that attract and they just love each other and they all that kind of stuff, right? Get a Life, Chloe Brown. What's the other one? Danny Brown. Like that's like a familiar trope. And like, I don't hate that trope. There are ways that you can do it well, like red, white, and royal blue. Like that, I feel like the trope worked super well. I was super invested in both characters. It was great. Like I don't have an issue with that trope necessarily. I just felt like it was so poorly executed in this book that it was just like really difficult to get through. And this was one of those books that I had to read. I think it was like the first like 60% that I was like, oh my God, can you stop? Plant-Based Bride also mentioned that this book is written entirely from the male gaze, and that is absolutely 100% true. It was just like everyone's worth was whether or not they were attractive. And it was just like disappointing because I feel like Sarah J Maas's characters in the past have a lot more depth to them and a lot more characterization, a lot more personality that is outside of whether or not someone is attractive. And I was just so disappointed that this is what it was at. I think I stayed up to like 4 reading this book and then I was just so angry at the ending. I didn't hate the ending. I don't hate how it ended, but I just hated how everything came together that I was just so mad about it. And I was like, oh my God, I spent like a week reading this book. I'm just like so unsatisfied. I probably should have just DNF'd it, but again, Sarah J Maas is like one of my favorite authors, so I figured I would just give it a chance, but God, it was so bad. I rated it a 2.5 because I don't hate the main character. I just hated the writing style. There are points where she would write, oh God, I put it in like my stories, I think, on my Lisa Loves Leaves account. Okay, so there's this new character that comes on and he's like kind of a villain, but kind of not a villain. It's not really like explained. He's just one of the character's bosses. So he meets the main character for the first time. And the first things you see from like the main character's perspective is his voice, silk and steel and ancient stone. He could probably make someone merely by whispering filthy things in their ear. He has a sexy voice. That's all that was trying to say, but I just felt like the metaphors and the similes were just so far-fetched and like so distracting where it was like, I don't see what this adds to the story. And like nowhere in this book did the sexiness of his voice come to play. Like it wasn't relevant to the story. It didn't add anything. It didn't make you like the character more or dislike the character. It just like, it added nothing. And it just, I was so frustrated. I don't know if I'll read other books in the series because like I didn't hate the world, but the world was just like really complicated and really weird. It was fantasy, but modern. So there were cell phones, there was internet, but then there were also like all of the different fantasy races available. It was just a little disjointed. I don't know. Was not a fan and I was pretty disappointed with it. 2.5. I wouldn't recommend the book. I don't know. I really love Sarah J Maas. I really love A Court of Thorns and Roses. I really love Throne of Glass. But this was just like such a huge miss for me and I don't know. I don't know what happened. The next book that I read was Hood Feminism, which is the nonfiction pick that I had for my book club on TVV Nerds. I rated this 5 stars. I felt like it was such a comprehensive book about all the different things that come into play with anti-racism, microaggressions. Hood Feminism covered a lot of different topics that I didn't even consider, but are so important to your activism and like why we need to be more conscious of like different aspects that are more impacted based on misogynoir and intersections of oppression that we need to be aware of. There are just so many different layers of barriers and oppression. If you've never read any other anti-racism book, I felt like this book is a really, really good place for anyone to start because she comprehensively covers a little bit of everything, but is very approachable. Like the language is like very easy to consume. It's not overly complicated in jargon or complicated terms. Like it's very approachable, but also doesn't like mince words about it. Like it was a really, really good book. And I feel like everyone in the Discord who came to talk about it, we had a significantly smaller turnout this month than we did last month. So last month, I think like 32 people showed up. And then this month, 8 people showed up, which is like still amazing. Honestly, when I first started the book club, I really only expected like maybe 10 people to show up. So the fact that we had like 8 people reading Hood Feminism, I just thought it was like really interesting. Everyone had really great stuff to say and to pitch in and like their own experiences based on like their background as well. Thank you everyone in the TVV Nerds who came out to discuss this book. Overall, like it seemed like a lot of people had a lot of things to take away from the book. So highly recommend this book. The next book that I read was the second book of the Mistborn series called The Well of Ascension. I rated this a 4.5. This took me a while to read. It's like fairly slow paced, and I felt like this was very like plot driven, but I just felt like the relationship between, I don't really want to spoil it, so I'm just going to be pretty vague. So if you've read the book, you'll know what I'm talking about. But the main character and the character's love interest, I just felt like were written to be like they were destined to be together, but like I didn't really see why they should be together. Like they were just together because they loved each other. Maybe I'm just jaded, and maybe I've just been through too much to know that like sometimes just like love isn't enough for a relationship to work. I just feel like they were both from different places in life and like had different priorities, different goals, different perspectives that like I didn't really feel like were compatible for a relationship. And maybe that's just like lessons that I've had to learn that have led me to the relationship that I am in now. And so I'm like very critical of certain things. That was like my only issue with the book, but I really liked the plot of the story. I liked where it went. I really love the arc of the Pheromancy and like their pursuit of knowledge. I just like find that world really interesting, and I'm excited to read the third book, The Hero of Ages. That'll be coming up on my Libby on the hold relatively soon, so I'm excited to read it. If you like fantasy, I highly recommend the series. I feel like I'm like the last person to read Brandon Sanderson. In the booktube world, everyone freaking loves Brandon Sanderson. For good reason. He's a really good writer, and his worlds are like very new and fresh. So the next book that I read was for my book club. It is one of my other book. I'm a part of 3 book clubs. I've gone on tangents on this before in my previous book videos. One of the book clubs that I'm in, this was the pick, The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee. I just thought this book was like so lovely. I loved a lot of things. Oh, I remember writing this review on my Storygraph. I had written this long giant review, and then I accidentally hit back and my entire review was gone. And I was so frustrated that I just decided to write out the review in point form, but it was still like really long. So I have in point form the things that I loved about this book. I found that the writing style in this book was just so descriptive, so unlike most literature that I had ever read. There was a lot of use of like proverbs or like proverb-like sentences. I'm not familiar enough with like Chinese culture or mythology to like know of these proverbs, and I feel like a lot of these proverbs that Stacey Lee used were similar to like Vietnamese ones. I just found them like really lovely and poetic, and like they made the main character seem so much wiser than she actually might have been. Or I don't know, she was like 16, but like she was like a wise 16-year-old, and I just found the main character just so like effervescent, so sassy, strong-willed, and like determined. So this book is a historical fiction based in the era just before Jim Crow laws were enacted. She describes during like the late 1800s, after slavery had been abolished, America would import immigrants from China to do and replace the labor that like enslaved people had once occupied. There's this like limbo that Stacey Lee describes as what Chinese people are in America, because like they're not black but they're not white, so they're in this weird limbo. And it's interesting to see characters talk about it and like experience it, how they kind of have to be hidden, whether or not they align in solidarity with black folks during that time who are dealing with this like overt racism, or if they align themselves with white people because they can be sort of white passing or like the model minority in order to survive. It's interesting to see colorism at play in this. I found like the characters were like so well fleshed out. Like all characters were like very distinct, had their own personalities, and like where the book ended, you can sort of imagine where each character would be and would do. Like you understood them, you understood their motivations pretty clearly. I just think that that is a powerful skill in writing, that like you make these characters that are so real that they live outside of your book. I loved the narrative and like the defiance of the main character, loved her iron will and her kind heart. And I felt like she was just really strong and really admirable and really cool. Like she was just like a really cool character. I also appreciated in this book that all the loose ends were like tied up. I think that's like one of my biggest pet peeves, when things like are kind of left out in the open. I just want to know what happens. Give me an ending, whether or not it's good or bad, like a happy ending or like an unhappy ending. I just want to know what happens. I really appreciated it. And like the ending for this, a lot of it kind of seemed protagonist syndrome, or like a little bit too improbable, but like it's kind of what my heart wanted anyway. So like I'm happy that things ended the way that they did. I rated this a 5. I really enjoyed this book. It was really fun and really well written. The next book that I read was a book that a bunch of you had recommended because I wanted to read more Vietnamese authors. Ocean Vuong is a gay Vietnamese author, I think based in America. Yeah, based in the States. I rated this a 4 stars, but I had a really hard time reading this, mostly because it was like a really emotional and difficult book. I think it was like an important book and it was beautifully written. It's kind of written in like poetry prose. Like each chapter is like sort of like a flashback to a certain time or like a certain event, and it's just like these little snippets of moments written so beautifully in prose that's like poetry. It was like really dark. Ocean Vuong talks about his relationship with his mother, and like this book is sort of like a love letter to his mom about the different things that have shaped him and made him who he was, and like the different experiences that he saw of his mother, of his family, and the stories that made them who they were and like their lived experiences. And his mom was a refugee from the Vietnam War, has a really tough story and life story. Obviously from her experiences, she dealt with like PTSD and a lot of like emotional trauma from all of that. You see that in the impact on the relationship that Ocean has with his mother, and I had a really hard time because I see a lot of my mother in her. I mean, obviously not to the same extent, but there's a lot of like emotional trauma and abuse that happens in Vietnamese culture within families that like people don't talk about, and I found it like really difficult to read because I saw a lot of myself in that, as well as someone who identifies as queer, has never come out to my family, and is something that I'm like still sort of working through right now. Yeah, there was like a lot of like physical and emotional abuse and a lot of confusion and like really raw truth telling, and it was just like very powerful but difficult to read. I would recommend this book, but it is not a happy read. The next book that I read was a little bit more happy but still pretty heavy. So this book was Under the Rainbow by Celia Laskey. This was the book that I read for my personal book club with my friends. This book follows the lives of a few people in a town that has been identified based on a bunch of statistics as like the most bigoted town in America. I don't think it's a real town. It's called Big Burr, Kansas. As someone who grew up in a small town, probably not as small as this town, but like pretty small, I knew all of these characters. I've seen all of these characters and like the justifications that they make for their racism or their bigotry or whatever interactions that they have with different characters. I knew these people. It was hard to read, but it was like you fell in love with a lot of characters. So the way that this book is written is that it's written from a bunch of different perspectives of this one town, but you don't really revisit the same person twice, which I found was kind of a shame because as I was reading, you like each chapter is about like maybe 15% of the book, okay? You get one person and then you move on to the next chapter and it's another person and then another person and another person. And it wasn't until I was like 70% of the book that I was like, oh, we're not going back to this first person, are we? I was kind of interested in like seeing how that played out. And I was kind of disappointed in that, but I understand the effect of retelling the story from like 16 different perspectives. I found it really well written, and I found that the characters were all super real and super interesting. I just wish I had seen some characters more. And then there was other characters where I was like, ew, I hate you. I don't want to know why you act the way that you do, even though I think it's important to understand why people are ignorant or do bigoted things or say bigoted things. Like I think it's important to understand from that perspective so that you can like try to explain to them why XYZ thing that they said was wrong. But boy, it was rough to read. Highly recommend. I rated this a 4.5. The only reason why it's not a 5 is because I wanted more from certain characters. And then the last book that I read, I technically finished this book in March, but I'm just gonna say I finished it in February because I started it in February and I finished it on March 1st. And it was Akata Warrior by Nnedi Okorafor. And I read the first book for one of my book clubs. It was my first suggestion for a book club, and that was like my nomination. I loved this book. I loved the first one, and I really enjoyed the second one. I rated it a 4.5. I didn't write an actual review, but I just love all the different characters, and I just think that the world itself is very beautiful. I love where the story went in terms of the plot. I love that knowledge is currency and knowledge is power in this world of magical realism. I loved getting to know more of like Lagos and like African culture and West African culture. It's just really cool to read more fantasy from like a Nigerian perspective. Would really recommend it. There's only 2 in the series, and as such, I'm going to be reading a bunch more from Nnedi Okorafor because I think her worlds are just really amazing. I think YA fantasy technically is just so well written, and she has a bunch of books coming out as shows. So I think there's a couple shows. I think Binti's coming into like a TV adaptation. That's what I read in February. And I have a bunch of books that I'm reading in March. I'll pull them up here. I don't know if I'll really get to all of them, but you know, I'm optimistic. My book club pick for my book club is Hollow Kingdom by Kira Burton, I think it is. A lot of people have recommended that to me. I'm really excited to read it. It is a fantasy fiction. That book club is in April, so that will be like not prioritized for me for this month, but I think I'll still read it this month because I really wanted to read it. I'm currently reading Shadows in Time. I'm actually really frustrated about this book because I was trying to read it on my Kobo, but it would not sync properly, and I have literally been troubleshooting for a month with Overdrive. I'm reading it on my phone currently, which is like kind of difficult, and it's like impeding my ability to read it because I really hate reading on my phone because I just get distracted by all the notifications. I've read the 4 previous books of Shadows in Time. It's like a series called the Kendra Donovan series. Highly recommend the series. It's a very like villain of the week, serial killer hunting kind of historical fiction. Really enjoy it. So I'm looking forward to finishing it. I'm at 21% right now. Another book that I'm reading currently is From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is a book that is like really common and popular in bookish communities. A lot of people seem to really like it. I started reading it. I think I'm like maybe 5% through. It's a romance, and I like the romance so far. It's just like very silly, but I am enjoying it. My next book that I'm reading for book club with my friends is Song of Achilles. I'm very excited. As a Latin/classics nerd from high school and before that, I always loved like Greek and Roman mythology, so I just love that world. I know a lot about it. I was in classics club. I like loved all that kind of stuff, so I'm looking forward to reading that. And then the other book that I'm reading for book club is 50 Words for Rain by Asha Lemmy, and I'm very excited about that. Yeah, I have a lot of books to read in March. I haven't had a ton of time to read lately. I've been very busy, plus a lot of personal stuff has come up, so I haven't really been able to focus on that kind of stuff. Plus, I started doing TikTok. Surprisingly, that sucks up a lot of my time, which I should have known, but one of my TikToks went viral, the 2-ingredient seitan, and I dealt with the aftermath of that for a while. A lot of people were mad about seitan and how it sounds like Satan. That is the recap of reading this month. I know that these are very long videos and they're not very popular, but I really enjoy doing them and I really enjoy talking to you about books. So if you liked it, please give it a like. If you want to hear about the other books that I've read in previous months, I have only recently started doing book videos, so there's like 3 total. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know what you're currently reading, what you think of some of the books that I've read. And also, if you want to follow my Bookstagram, it's like my bullet journal /plant /Bookstagram. It's just like my alt account for like a bunch of different things, but it's Lisa Loves Leaves if you want to follow that there. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a delicious day full of cozy, great reads. Bye.